You just said that you would practice the dance steps and your father would be holding a belt in his hand. Is that what you just said?
Yes.
He sold out stadiums on 5 continents and reshaped pop music forever. But ask Michael Jackson about rehearsal, and the first thing he remembered wasn't the music. It was a belt in his father's hand, waiting for the smallest mistake. That's the part of the Michael Jackson story most people skip past on their way to the moonwalk and the gloves. We're not skipping it. In a 2003 sit-down, Michael walked through what rehearsals actually looked like inside the Jackson home, and the picture he painted had nothing to do with talent. Every mistake during a dance run-through got treated like a crisis. Perfection wasn't the goal, it was the price of safety. Do it like Michael became the phrase Joe used to push the other brothers, turning one child's success into a weapon against the rest of them. Michael later said he believed it was his brother Marlon who suffered worst of all, caught permanently in a comparison he never asked for. But Michael admitted he wasn't spared either. He remembered his mother, Catherine, begging Joe to stop a beating while it was actually happening, her voice cutting through a room that had already decided what was going to happen regardless.
No such thing as beating a kid. You whip them and punish them for something they did.
That's Joe Jackson, decades later, still drawing a hard line between the word whip and the word beat, like the difference mattered to the child on the other end of it. His son told a different story: fear, hiding, a body that learned to brace itself before it learned almost anything else. Both men are describing the exact same house. So which version do you trust? And does picking a side even change what already happened inside those walls? While his brothers were getting hit, Michael was getting watched from the inside of a glass box. Motown's Hitsville studio in Detroit sat directly across the street from a neighborhood park, and through that thin pane of glass, he could hear baseball games, football, kids laughing. An entire ordinary childhood happening 20 feet away that he wasn't allowed to step into. Summers that should have belonged to him outside got swallowed by vocal takes and rehearsal schedules instead. He admitted decades later that he still thought about wanting to walk across that pavement, and that he never once got to. School disappeared right around the same time. Once the family's fame started climbing, regular classrooms in Gary, Indiana, got replaced almost overnight by private tutors, and his entire social world narrowed down to just his brothers, day after day, with no outside comparison to measure any of it against. Adults around him kept describing him as an old soul trapped in a kid's body, like it was some kind of compliment. It wasn't. It meant a child was already carrying an adult's workload and an adult's pressure before he'd ever had one ordinary day of school to compare it to.
Which was terrible. And maybe I would run around the house and hide.
Running and hiding wasn't a one-time reaction. It became a pattern, repeated often enough that the body started reacting to the threat before the mind even had time to catch up. That pattern didn't stay in childhood. This is where the story gets strange, and it's worth sitting with for a second instead of rushing past it. As an adult, a global superstar who could fill stadiums on command, Michael would reportedly get physically sick, vomiting, shaking, even fainting, the exact moment his father walked into a room. Nothing dangerous was actually happening in that moment. His nervous system was still reacting to a threat that had technically ended decades earlier, but his body had never gotten the memo. Millions of screaming fans could chant his name on any given night, and none of that adoration could switch off a panic response his body had quietly learned as a child and never unlearned. Now here's where Joe Jackson's own words get a lot harder to brush aside. In a 2013 interview, he was asked directly whether he regretted how tough he'd been on his kids.
I'm glad I was tough because look what I came out with. I came out with some kids that everybody loved all over the world.
No hesitation in his voice, no real pause to think it over. To him, the results spoke for themselves, and the results justified absolutely everything that got them there. That's the entire defense laid out in one breath. Discipline reframed as protection, fear reframed as a kind of love, and he wasn't alone in that framing either. Michael's mother, Catherine, said something strikingly similar when Oprah Winfrey pushed her on the subject directly in 2010, telling her flatly that this was simply how Black families of their generation raised children, strap included, no apology necessary. Whatever you make of that explanation, it never seemed to erase what was actually happening inside Michael. Being singled out as the favorite came with its own hidden cost, one nobody talked about as openly. Instead of pulling the brothers closer together, it isolated him completely. He wasn't really part of the group anymore in his own mind. He was the group's product, and somewhere along the way he started to know it. One fear in particular stuck with him for the rest of his life. If the music ever stopped making money, he would be thrown away just as quickly as he'd been promoted. Even staggering success couldn't buy him something as simple as a vacation. Interviews bled directly into recording sessions, which bled into tours, which bled right back into more interviews, with barely a gap wide enough to notice. He once admitted, almost confused by his own answer, that he genuinely didn't know how to respond when someone asked what his ideal vacation would even look like. He'd never actually had one long enough to compare it to anything. Strangely, the one place that never felt like pressure to him was the stage itself. Most performers describe walking out in front of thousands of people as the most nerve-wracking part of the job. Michael felt the exact opposite. In front of total strangers under bright lights, he said he felt safe, safer in some genuinely sad way than he ever felt at home.
I love my children. I was holding my son tight and strong. Why would I throw a baby about?
That's Michael, years later, describing the kind of father he chose to become instead of the one he'd grown up with. Affectionate, physically present, generous with the warmth he never got handed himself. He never tried to pretend the damage wasn't real. He said carrying anger forever simply wasn't worth the weight of it. But he also never confused forgiveness with forgetting. And he made sure people understood those were two completely different things.
I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna build a water park on the other side of this mountain.
That one line, almost thrown away in conversation, somehow says more about him than any direct quote about trauma ever could. A man who could buy nearly anything on earth still wanted, more than almost anything else, to build the childhood he never got to have, for other people, since there was no way left to get his own back.
I'd like to ask for my sister, Latoya and Janet.
His sister Janet later described him as gentle, sharp, endlessly intelligent, and full of love. Someone who, in her words, always seemed to know exactly who he was underneath everything. But she also admitted that her own relationship with their father was never simple or easy either, which is a small detail that says something much bigger. This was never just a one-child problem tucked away in one corner of the house. It ran straight through every room of it. So who was Joe Jackson before any of this started? He grew up poor in Arkansas, inside a household shaped early on by instability, and eventually settled in Indiana working a steel mill job that offered survival more than comfort. He married Catherine in 1949, and the family grew quickly from there, eventually reaching 10 children, though tragedy struck early when Marlon's twin brother Brandon passed away shortly after birth in 1957. By the early 1960s, Joe had taken 5 of his sons and built them into a group through nonstop rehearsal and discipline that rarely let up. That group became the Jackson 5, and songs like I Want You Back and ABC pushed them into a level of fame nobody inside that house could have realistically predicted just a few years earlier. Other family members have since defended Joe's methods as standard discipline for the time and the neighborhood they were raised in. Joe himself never once accepted the word abuse, not in any interview, not at any point. That argument didn't end when Michael's life did, either. After his son's death, Joe claimed Michael had once told their mother that people were planning to kill him over his publishing rights, a fear he said he only learned about afterward. He also pointed to Michael's manager, Dieter Wiesner, claiming Michael had voiced similar fears to him too, fears that he says were ultimately brushed aside by the people around him. Joe refused to place all the blame on Dr. Conrad Murray alone. He argued publicly that Michael had been exploited by far more people than just one doctor, and that real justice, in his view, needed to reach well beyond a single conviction. Michael himself eventually traced almost all of it back to his art. He explained more than once that real music only works when it taps into something raw and unguarded inside a listener, something universal enough to cut across age, background, and language. His own missing childhood pushed him toward performers like James Brown and Sammy Davis Jr., men who had learned to turn personal pain into pure explosive stage energy long before he ever met them. He came to believe that protecting childhood innocence in any child was one of the most important things a person could spend a life doing. That conviction is the direct reason his charitable foundations leaned so heavily into children's welfare and education, long after his own childhood was already permanently gone. In an old interview, Joe looked back on exactly where it all started. Small clubs in Chicago, brutal winters spent driving back and forth between Gary and Chicago for shows that barely paid anything at all, right up until the Apollo Theater finally said yes to them. He said he always believed his kids had what it took to make it big. Getting there, in his own words, simply took non-stop rehearsal and a level of discipline that never once let up, no matter how tired anyone got. Whether you walk away from all of this, seeing a father who built one of the most successful musical families in history, or a man who never fully admitted the real cost of how he built it, both things happened inside the exact same house, to the exact same kids. Michael spent the rest of his life quietly trying to answer which one mattered more. He never fully landed on one side of that question. Maybe that uncertainty is the most honest part of the entire story.